Finally got to see my most anticipated film of the year, and I'm happy to tell you it's everything I wished for and more. Flanagan has done an amazing job adapting the book from Stephen King and giving lovers of the Kubrick film adaptation of The Shining a cinematic sequel. Dr. Sleep then concludes as a grand horror epic, never losing sight of its characters even in a final stretch of familiar iconography and callbacks. If you're going to this film expecting it to be a straight-up sequel to the Kubrick film with the same horror tone, you'll be disappointed. However, if you have an open mind, this movie is very well directed and acted, and the story is very compelling. With this one, Mike Flanagan might have graduated to being the most gifted genre craftsman of his generation.
In 2019, director Mike Flanagan's adaptation of Stephen King's Dr. Sleep was released to generally positive to mixed reviews from critics, but I would say mostly erring on the positive side. The movie and its novel counterpart, which the novel was released in 2013, are direct sequels to The Shining, which is considered to be one of the best in both of its mediums and respective genres. Following up on this legendary achievement in both filmmaking and novel writing would always prove to be fundamentally difficult, especially without an auteur as precise as Stanley Kubrick or as inventive as Stephen King was in the late 70s and early 80s. As such, Flanagan flew his adaptation much closer to the book that Stephen King wrote, causing many people to comment on how much more faithful Flanagan's film is to its book compared to Kubrick's, which isn't technically wrong, but I do think that there's a lot that was missed. So while I don't entirely discredit other people's opinions on the film, I do disagree in large part with the general consensus of Dr. Sleep. What others might see as reverent attachment to one of horror's greatest films of all time, I see as pandering and distracting. It is physically impossible to go 10 minutes in this movie without overreaching auditory and visual references to what I consider to be a cinematically superior film, with those references being made specifically, at least in my mind, to bait people that have fond memories of The Shining. In doing so, I strongly believe that the praise that has been lauded for this film has more to do with what people remember from The Shining rather than this film's actual prowess or lack thereof. In a similar vein to how a lot of people unilaterally agreed that The Lion King 2019 was dull, uninspired, and a very stripped-down version of its original, highly regarded animated film, and yet that movie still went on to make $1 billion at the box office. It's no secret that Stephen King openly dislikes Kubrick's The Shining, and it's not hard to see where it's coming from having read it on my Kindle, but what I think Kubrick still did well was maintain the isolation and the general senses that Stephen King wrote into his book. And he was a little bit more implicit in his details, which makes the movie a bit more of a mystery, and it becomes its own thing. Comparatively, Flanagan tries to adhere to the book, but because the core of the story was ignored or passed over as an inconvenience to the narrative, the end result is a film that completely alienates itself from both its predecessor and its source material. It took me a while to get around to watching The Shining, mostly because I'm an absolute pansy when it comes to the horror genre, but I'm glad that I did end up seeing it. I also happened to watch 2001: A Space Odyssey to round out a bit more of Kubrick's highly regarded directorial lineup of films, mostly to help myself understand the late director's filmmaking style. To keep it extremely short, the two movies have a notable similarity in their craft work, in how Kubrick loved his extended takes. 2001: A Space Odyssey and The Shining have a very distinctive style to them in how they applied their suspenseful elements, turning unfamiliarity into unease. The change is gradual, subtle, or culminates in one scene that, while innocuous or obscure to the characters, we, the audience, have dreaded the arrival of such a moment. After the switch happens, the destruction and demise of the world we have slowly been introduced to is equally as gradual, and all we can do is watch as Kubrick's hydraulic writing press slowly crushes what we knew into a fine paste. This approach leaves viewers wondering about the finer details, which are left delightfully ambiguous because the nature of said elements are also unknown to the characters themselves. They don't have moments where they turn to the screen and say, yes, HAL was constructed to specifically sabotage the mission because its creator wanted nobody to tamper with the mysteries of space. And that sounds ridiculous, but a common storytelling tool that movies use is the audience stand-in, some hapless character that other characters vomit expository dialogue at. One of my favorite examples is the character Ariadne in Inception, where she's brought in from a position of inexperience and has Dom explain almost everything to her, with Arthur chiming in on occasion. So everything from time moving differently in dreams, to the dangers of manipulating dreams, all the way to Dom's personal struggles. Whatever new concept the movie wants to throw at us, Ariadne is sure to stand in place to hear it for the audience's sake. Sometimes it's necessary to have the stand-in, but quite often it detracts from the subtleties that the movie could otherwise bake into its setting and narrative. In fact, sometimes subtleties will be outright ignored because the property knows it can lazily spew exposition by metaphorically grabbing the audience by its collective shoulders and shoving them down the narrative path highlighted by runway lights and big flashing arrow signs. The Shining opens on some extremely long shots of a station wagon winding through a forested mountain highway, and while the camera loosely follows the vehicle, a musical motif plays. It's unsettling and is designed to make the viewer believe that the occupant is driving into danger or that the occupant is dangerous themselves.
I am the danger.
And so these long takes continue, from Jack's swagger as he strolls across the foyer of the Overlook Hotel to his interview with the hotel's owner as Jack aims to take stewardship of the location over the winter. And in this interview, we learn of a tragedy that befell the Overlook Hotel many years prior. But it's passed off from the interview as a dark half-joke, like, ooh, careful new grocery store employee, make sure you don't play around in the garbage compactor. True to what we have seen of him so far, Jack responds with cool and neutral confidence. No urgency, no musical prompts, no sudden cuts to him opening the back of his car to see an axe lying there. Nothing but torrents and the curse of having Jack Nicholson's face. It's here where the first instance of this movie's all-important question hits. Is Jack's descent into madness truly a result of the insanity that lurks within the Overlook's walls, or were his actions premeditated from this moment, and he was merely biding his time? If the former is true, then his response here is genuine and placating.
Well, that sounds fine to me.
But if the latter is true, then our suspicions are confirmed, and Jack is simply waiting for the right moment to make his murderous intentions true. We're never given a direct answer to the question, but rather are asked to draw our own conclusions given the events the characters are witness to or even a part of. And the movie simply does not stop with the long takes. What was initially harmless exposition and location setting gradually becomes grotesque and hellish. We don't want to see what's around the corner or behind the bar or on the other side of the shower curtain, but The Shining keeps on going like, oh come on, it's just a regular old long day. We've seen at least 36 of these by now. So now the movie has taken something so unwittingly familiar and turned it into a feeling of serious discomfort while doing much of the same. You have Jack hallucinating the butler at the bar, his visions of the full ballroom, and the promise of warmth and company. His face gradually twisting into that wide, maniacal grin that could only be pulled off by Jack Nicholson, the discovery of his typewriter dictating his madness, his eventual stalking and attempted murder of Wendy. All of it is captured with the same slow-mounting suspense whose pace is only dictated by the urgency of its characters. We, the audience, get to see how long it takes Wendy to barricade herself in the bathroom while she struggles to force open the window that has been frozen shut. You feel the impossible cold, the immensity of the maze-like frozen hedges as Danny and Wendy desperately try to escape Jack's clutches. There is a human slowness to her movements. Intrinsically, we know Wendy is moving as fast as she can, but if only she could be a little bit faster. In these moments, the long takes capture everything and give so much agency to the impressive sets that the film was captured on. Something else that I love this movie for is how it has a kind of call and answer for each location throughout its runtime. The first call of the settings is there when Halloran, the remaining staff, and patrons of the Overlook are still milling around the common areas, and thanks to the era that this film was made in, the sets are very real. You can practically hear the scuff of footfalls against the red and orange carpet, smell the sterilized residue of all-purpose cleaner in the kitchen, and taste the air that surrounds the mountains that the Torrance family drives into. The cleanliness of the hotel makes sense because cleanliness is expected in such a setting, but even this detail, which leaves things unobstructed, makes the Torrance family's isolation so much more realized. And then after all that, the film answers back. When Jack is running through the kitchen, or up the stairs to the lobby, or through the abandoned hallways, my brain is reminded of the times when there were other people here, when the hotel was alive, and there was something standing in his way. Now all that remains is Jack on a straight and spotless path to the utter destruction of his family for reasons we aren't really made privy to. And by the time the film reaches its end and Jack Torrance perishes in the sub-zero conditions, I feel as though I was pushed back into my seat, like a weight was placed on my chest and gradually pressed down on as the film progressed. The ending is a relief and a breath of fresh air that still leaves my head spinning to this day. I frequently reflect on this movie because nothing told me directly what to think about specific events. There was no audience stand-in, as all of the conversations the characters have are conversations that matter to them specifically. The audience happens to be a fly on the wall, left to glean what details they choose, and that's what's so special about it. When a movie is allowed to be immersive with its setting by suspending disbelief with what seems so natural to the characters themselves, that's where any genre shines, and it's where The Shining excels. Scenes that have caused us to become naturalized, that prey on our fear of the unknown while feeling totally logical for the character experiencing them, is why this movie is so damn good 45 years later. And thus the question for movie watchers remains, was Jack hallucinating or were they fond memories? The ending shot with him in the framed photo from several decades prior can insinuate any number of things, so in some ways it's up to you to decide if you choose to ignore the book.
Did you like Kubrick's film of The Shining?
No. Cold. I'm not a cold guy. I mean, I think one of the things that people relate to in my books is there's a warmth, there's a reaching out and saying to the reader, I want you to be a part of this. And with Kubrick's The Shining, I felt that it was very cold, very, well, looking at these people, but they're like ants in an anthill. Aren't they doing interesting things, these little insects?
This interview was recorded in 2013, shortly after King's second novel in the series was published. Many other clickbaity sources generally cite his disdain for Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining, and I was honestly impressed to see that he carried that sentiment into the 21st century. It is true, though. Kubrick's movie is nothing like King's book in its execution, and I like how in the BBC interview, King refers to the film as cold, and that he himself tries to write a more inviting, redemptive warmth to his characters. And that much is apparent with how the first 10 chapters of The Shining are about the Torrance family. It goes in depth into their current dilapidated state, reiterating the condition of their rundown 1968 Volkswagen and shoddy apartment in Boulder, Colorado, which is a far cry from their lofty lodgings that they moved out of in Vermont. The point of this lengthy preamble isn't to bore you, but to make you intimately familiar with the tribulations that led the Torrance family to take the job at the Overlook Hotel. In the opening act, the book takes plenty of time to make its characters humanistic, something which I feel is missed in Kubrick's film. Not to mention that the supernatural nature of the Overlook Hotel and the highly expressive performances from Shelley Duvall and Jack Nicholson make the film feel a little more surrealist. King's writing is more grounded, especially when it comes to crafting the self-destruction of Jack Torrance, and that's what makes me want to cheer for him, despite already kind of knowing the ending. Jack Torrance is a disgraced English professor turned freelance writer, displayed as stoic but extremely temperamental. He's creative, he's powerful, and yet he is deeply troubled by his rough upbringing that has now resulted in rampant alcoholism. He always expresses his desire to do his best for his family, Danny and Wendy, but often lets his pride and temper get the better of him at crucial moments. He is very much the caricature of a struggling alcoholic who, I believe, wants to do better, but because of his pride, he never makes the proper reconciliations to do so. While he yearns to do better, he often seeks counsel from his drinking buddies or no help at all, internally believing that asking for help is a surefire sign of weakness, and also that he believes that he can't really rely on anyone that he considers himself to be better than. When he lashes out, he's mortified by his actions later, but always chooses to reconcile in solitude, believing himself to be self-sustaining. With his childhood being shown in explicitly detailed flashback sequences, it's not difficult to understand where this habit of self-isolation comes from. His father was extremely abusive, and he held a position of power over everyone else in his family. He couldn't go to his siblings or even his mother for help because they were suffering the same abuses that he was. And if his father detected any weakness in him, it was beaten into submission. I'm not noticing anything particularly groundbreaking here, but rather pointing out what I believe to be the source of Jack's exacerbation and failure to change. In a far less intense manner of speaking, one of the things that I want to say is I want to exercise more, but my brain chemicals keep telling me, ooh, it'd be fun to sit inside and work on YouTube videos. At least that's what I tell myself because I almost never upload here. Therefore, we can simultaneously fault Jack for his actions while also hoping he does better because that is the desire that he openly expresses. So when Jack is at the bottom of the barrel due to his own failings, he sees the isolation of the Overlook as an island of sobriety. He sees it as a chance to focus on writing again, away from the regular cacophony and worries of his everyday life. Problem is, isolation is what destroyed him before, and isolation would surely destroy him again. Who's to say what will happen when you put an already emotionally stressed, aggressive, recovering alcoholic into empty hallways haunted by malicious spirits? Nothing good, that's for sure. So with King's writing and portrayal of Jack Torrance now properly in perspective, the ending that the characters reach feels like an inevitability. His temperament was easy for the spirits of the Overlook Hotel to mold, because in a self-isolated attempt to escape the horrors of his past, Torrance opens up the possibility to be sucked right back into them. And that switch is best manifested by a quote regarding his thoughts towards his wife, comparing his own plight to that of his abusive father. Page 561 and 562 of the book read as follows. Hadn't it been the woman he was married to, a milksop sponge of a woman, mentally and spiritually dead, his mother had been handcuffed to his father by matrimony. Still, Daddy had tried to do right, as he dragged her rotting corpse through life. I mean, dear God, tell me how you really feel. The writing paints things in vibrant definites instead of floating conjectures, making the downfall of Jack Torrance equal parts unpleasant but reasonably finalized. So now let's talk about Danny. Danny is a 5-year-old with the ability to visualize pieces of reality that aren't fully in front of him, a telepathic gift which Dick Halloran, whom we meet later, refers to as the Shining. The range of his psychic abilities varies from premonition to visual manifestations that border on hallucination to outright telepathy. With his relative inability to speak, the story involving Danny hinges on what he sees and how it makes him feel emotionally. Most of the time, he feels scared or uncertain because he either doesn't know what words mean or the meaning of the reality that his powers reveal to him. He's also frequently visited by a shadowy figure that he calls Tony, which is the main proponent of Danny's premonitions. I kind of like to think that Tony was created by Danny as a slightly older peer that helps explain things to him. Kind of like a younger brother looking up to an older one, except the older one can predict the future. In practicality, Tony is more of an imaginary friend, as the actions of his father have led him to social isolation at a young age, to the point where Danny basically dreams up someone to play with. Either way, Tony is a clever narrative device that separates Danny's powers by giving him less perceived control over them, showing Danny things that are unsettling for reasons that the 5-year-old doesn't know how to verbalize. The greatest terror of Danny's life was divorce, a word that always appeared in his mind as a sign painted in red letters which were covered with hissing, poisonous snakes. In divorce, your parents no longer lived together. They had a tug of war over you in a court. Tennis court? Badminton court? Danny wasn't sure which or if it was some other, but Mommy and Daddy had played both tennis and badminton at Stoppington, so he assumed it could be either. What I find most fascinating about the visions that Danny is plagued with is how his parents react to how Danny acts. Jack, in all of his bravado and self-importance, shrugs off Danny's ill-communicated powers as the hyperactivity of a young child's mind. Wendy, on the other hand, gifted with an ounce of The Shining, tries her best to understand her child, but her meekness leads her to side more with her husband's reasoning. She can sense that there's something more, yet her inability to grasp it fully forces her to be emotionally sidelined as an observer rather than a contributor. Through the inhibitions of the adults in the story, even I was made uncertain of whether what Danny saw was real or the result of an overactive imagination. It was only a fire extinguisher, nothing else. It was stupid to think that it looked like some poison snake from Wide World of Animals that had heard him and woken up, even if the stitched canvas did look a little bit like scales. It's moments like these that makes one chuckle and say, oh right, I guess fire hoses do look like snakes, making it easy to brush off as pure fiction. And heck, I even have a very clear memory from when I was around 3 years old of when my parents had said that our PC had crashed. And I very clearly remember that in my toddler brain, I was trying to understand how one of those beige bricks could have gotten involved in a vehicular crash with another car. There's a scene later in the book where Danny is pursued by artisanal hedges, each trimmed to look like beasts of prey. When Danny finally reaches the safe haven of the Overlook Hotel's front patio, they suddenly snap back to being immobile hedges again. King, once again, cleverly plays with the idea that what Danny sees might not be real, because as an adult, I partially side with Jack's perspective. And also along the same lines, I find this anecdote from that BBC interview with Stephen King to be particularly funny. It feels like he's calling me out directly.
A lot of people read those books under the covers with flashlights when they were children themselves, 12, 14 years old, and you'll meet people who'll say, you know, I read that book, The Shining, or I read Salem's Lot, and it really scared the hell out of me. And I'm thinking to myself, well, sure, you were easy. You were, 14 and away from camp and shaking in your shoes.
With that perspective in mind, The Shining strikes an intriguing level of duplicity between its most prominent characters. One persistently lies to himself and always seeks out his own answers, while the other doesn't know how to properly articulate, and the audience doesn't understand what's entirely going on either. In between all of this is Wendy, in a position of forced neutrality, as a sort of referee for both sides. And I honestly feel bad for not being able to say as much about Wendy as I have for Jack and Danny. Sure, they are the two main characters most heavily influenced by the horrors of the narrative, but Wendy's direct influence over where the perspective of the story goes is relatively limited. That being said, she does show up at the most important parts of the book and is always a persistent hovering presence in the back of my mind, kind of like a mother hen watching over the coop to make sure that nothing really goes too wrong. Her decisions, combined with the status of women in the mid to late 70s, have her wanting to do the best to maintain peace within her own little family unit. Fun fact, women couldn't open their own bank accounts in the United States until 1974. Some of you watching this have mothers that are older than that universal right. In modern perspectives, it's so incredibly easy to look at Jack's horrific actions and think that Wendy needs to get out of there as soon as possible, but she's not allowed to. She is a victim of her own environment, with her best terms of survival being to placate her husband. When Jack, largely possessed by the spirits of the Overlook, dies by Wendy's hand, the status of her future becomes as uncertain as the ending of the book itself. Her death becomes her uneasy emancipation from the conflict that she was incapable of toppling, forced to believe the best of Jack for her own survival. And so, if we ignore the epilogue, the final line of the book reads as follows. The snow had stopped, and a silver dollar moon had peeked out through the raftering clouds. Far down the road, but coming towards them, coming upward through a series of S-shaped switchbacks, was a pearly chain of lights. The wind dropped for a moment, and Halloran heard the faraway buzzing snarl of snowmobile engines. Halloran and Danny and Wendy reached them 15 minutes later. They had brought extra clothes, and brandy, and Dr. Edmonds. And the long darkness was over. And that's it. For all intents and purposes, we do not know the fate of Danny and Wendy, but we can be led to assume that they concluded this chapter of their lives. I've spent a significant amount of time talking about the characterizations of the three lead characters because they are, by and large, the driving forces behind King's writing, while also being the key differences between the book and the movie. Narratively, Kubrick's The Shining follows a similar narrative pace to the book. and it evokes many of the same visuals as they were written, but it leaves a lot of the intentions of Jack Torrance up to ambiguity. Mostly because there wasn't a lengthy family-focused prologue leading up to the time at the Overlook Hotel. By moving the focus off King's characters, and even more so onto the non-communicative Danny, and more onto the nature of the setting, Kubrick is allowed more creative freedom in how he wants to direct the narrative. And yet, to me, it doesn't feel disrespectful because I can see the clear parallels between the two and understand that they both are mutually exclusive but still very good stories. As another example, DreamWorks' How to Train Your Dragon series is wildly different from the books, but the animated movies are well regarded even in comparison. Adapting a movie to fit into a concise narrative for the screen is fine, and it works well when the narrative is no longer similar enough to have comparisons as a main point of criticism. But in order to fully contextualize Dr. Sleep, I do need to address some large narrative changes between The Shining's movie and the book that make no sense in the sequel's movie if you haven't read the book. After all, The Shining was published in 1977, and we didn't get its sequel until 2013. First and foremost, the Overlook Hotel goes up in flames at the end of the book. It practically explodes. One of Jack's established responsibilities for his caretaker role at the Overlook Hotel is to watch over this ancient boiler to make sure it doesn't do that. If left unattended for too long, well, nobody knows what will happen, but everyone knows that it just won't be good. The scene where the attendant is showing Jack around the basement and the controls for the boiler itself is probably one of my favorites to read as well. You can practically feel the grime on the walls and the dust settling in around you. Here, listen to this. The boiler stood on 4 cement blocks, a long and cylindrical metal tank, copper-jacketed and often patched. It squatted beneath a confusion of pipes and ducts which zigzagged upward into the high, cobweb-festooned basement ceiling. To Jack's right, 2 large heating pipes came through the wall from the furnace in the adjoining room. "I got me a fucking cold," Watson said conversationally. "I get one around every September. I be tinkering down here with this old whore, then I be cutting the grass or raking that rope court. Get a chill and catch a cold," me old mum used to say. God bless her, she been dead 6 years. Cancer got her. Once the cancer gets you, you might as well make your will. Culminating in the entry towards the end of the book, where it does go up in flames. And as far as we understand through the epilogue, the site is all but destroyed, putting a definitive end to it all. Second change, Dick Halloran doesn't die. He is the first person to reach Danny and Wendy after rallying a rescue team from the nearby town, and is there to keep them company before help arrives. In the epilogue, Halloran is the one that takes care of Danny and Wendy after their departure from Colorado, and plays a key role in the opening of Dr. Sleep as well. Third and finally, Jack doesn't perish in sub-zero conditions, but actually dies by Wendy's hand. This is so important because up to this point, murder had been written out as an unthinkable act. And with the context of Wendy's societal position at the time, it is both a horrifying and yet empowering thing that she does. The insanity of the Overlook Hotel is so hellbent on extracting the Shining from Danny that after Wendy kills Jack, the hotel temporarily revives his corpse to try and get its hands on the child. In a moment of supernatural clarity, Danny himself repels the possessed corpse of his father to buy him and his mother enough time to escape the ticking time bomb of the Overlook's boiler. I also like how Jack's death is publicly portrayed as this heroic caretaker trying to maintain a boiler that probably should have been replaced after the Second World War. It's clever and partially explains how Wendy is able to pack up and move to Florida. Even though Jack had turned evil by his own self-isolation, he would then go on to be remembered by everyone else as a hero going down in a literal blaze of glory. So now that we're all caught up, let's see how King's writing holds up in the nearly 4 decades between publication dates by talking about Dr. Sleep. In book form at least, because if I start talking about the film, I'm going to keep going back and forth, comparing the two all the time, and no one can handle that amount of ADHD. Even with both books being written so far apart, Stephen King holds true to his staunch characterizations and striking portrayals of both settings and characters alike. The warm characters, as he puts it, continues in Dr. Sleep, with Dan Torrance's redemption as an adult being the key focal point. Largely set 30 years after the events of The Shining, an adult Dan Torrance is haunted by the ghosts of his past. Much like his father, he has attempted to find solace in isolation and the bottom of a bottle. Quite literally haunted, in fact, as the prologue opens up just a year after the events of The Shining. In the opening, we piece together that the chef Halloran put Danny and Wendy under his stewardship in Florida in light of Jack's passing. I've already talked about this, but more importantly, Halloran teaches Danny how to use the Shining as a tool for locking away the vengeful demons of the Overlook Hotel that might still be roaming around. Specifically, Halloran gives the child a toolbox and offers him advice in regards to using it, basically trying to get intimately familiar with this piece of metal so that he can image it in his head and use it as a way to securely lock the ghosts away. And then a little bit of time passes and we're greeted with a scene set in Danny and Wendy's apartment where old Mrs. Massey, the rotting woman from the bathroom from the Overlook, has somehow materialized in their bathroom there. She is subsequently locked away in the mental toolbox that we were shown a few paragraphs in a line break earlier, though both Wendy and Danny avoid the bathroom in the immediate future. From here, there's a little jump back in time to look at a character known as Andy, who also possesses a moderate amount of the Shining, knows it, and knows how to weaponize it. To summarize her character arc, she was the target of sexual abuse and harassment from older men when she was younger, and with her psychic abilities as they are now, she discovers that she can lure the predators in and then hypnotize them into admitting their misconduct to their families, effectively ruining their lives as much as hers was disrupted. These actions don't go fully unnoticed, as after her next hit, she is approached by a group that calls themselves the True Knot. I hope there aren't any furries watching this right now. The True Knot is a collection of shining vampires who roam the United States in search of their next big meal. They are attracted to surges of power, as it is their means of sustenance and eternal life. Think of you know how Entangled, Mother Gothel feeds off of the magic hair essence from Rapunzel, and then you have the Dementors from Harry Potter Prisoner of Azkaban. So mix those two things together, and that's basically what the True Knot is. But their goals with Andy aren't to kill her for her shining. They are to convert her to their ranks, since they find her power of seduction and suggestion extremely useful for luring targets in. All these opening scenes are important as they help establish what tools our characters possess as they go into the rest of the story. It helps establish our mysterious villain group, the True Knot, and helps us understand a broader scope of what the Shining can do, since it was mostly a divining tool before. But to criticize King's writing here briefly, the True Knot feels a bit forced compared to what we had in The Shining. I mean, sure, The Shining was very clear in stating that there were magic forces afoot, but those were more about the haunting of a specific location and kind of felt like those classic campfire stories. It's made to replicate hauntings of hotels or graveyards as we've seen throughout history, filling in the supernatural elements with a touch of horror's classics, little ghost stories. So when the scale is blown wide open to a literal drive across the country from New Hampshire to Colorado, because magic vampires have supposedly always existed, some of the chilling charm of the first book is lost to what I see as an MCU villain, in essence. More on that later. So this all brings us back to present day in the book. Danny Torrance, now simply Dan Torrance, is a model fuck-up citizen. After enduring the horrors of the Overlook and the many years of emotional fallout that followed, he finds that his psychic condition is best muted by drowning it in cheap paraphernalia, chiefly alcohol. Anything else is a bonus. One of the more terrifying things that we understand that Dan sees is swarms of flies around the faces of people who are already dead, but don't quite know it yet. This is something that we saw consume his own mother, as Wendy was a habitual smoker who eventually succumbed to lung disease. So with neither parent in the picture, with haunting images flashing across Dan's vision, it's no small wonder that he ends up spiraling out. King's writing describes Dan's cycle as a troubled nomad. He hops on a bus, takes it as far as the line will take him, finds employment at a local hospice, collects a paycheck, spends it all on booze, gets fired from work for showing up drunk, and then starts the cycle all over again. The first scene that Dan is written into perfectly encapsulates just how hard he has hit rock bottom. It's not just in his actions, but in the dilapidated setting as well. Dan Torrance opened his eyes. Sunlight shot through them and into his aching head, threatening to set his brains on fire. The hangover to end all hangovers. No more of that blazing sun, please, not yet. He was lying on a bare mattress on a bare floor. A bare woman lay sprawled on her back beside him. He looked down and saw that he was also al fresco. The bathroom was directly across a short stub of a hall. The door was open, the toilet seat up. Dan lunged, fell on his knees, and spewed a great flood of brownish yellow stuff on top of a floating turd. He looked away, groped for the flush, found it, pushed it. Water cascaded, but there was no accompanying sound of draining water. He looked back and saw something alarming. The turd, probably his own, rising towards the pea-splashed rim of the toilet bowl on a sea of half-digested bar snacks. And just before the toilet could overspill, making this morning's banal horrors complete, something cleared its throat in the pipe, and the whole mess flushed away. A part of him wants to reconcile with his poor decisions, as there are several sentences referring to his regrets as well. He saw something worse. The woman wasn't a woman after all. Probably not jailbait, please God, not jailbait, but surely no more than 20 and maybe still in her late teens. On one wall, chillingly childish, was a poster of Kiss with Gene Simmons spewing fire. On another was a cute kitten with startled eyes dangling from a tree branch. "Hang in there, baby," the poster advised. He needed to get out of here. And upon reading this for the first time, I was heavily reminded of a similar pattern that we saw in Jack, which makes sense, they are related after all. The heavy drinking, the regret, and the empty promises to do better on his own terms. It's kind of poetic, really. Tying off the scene is the reveal of Deanie's unnamed toddler, an innocent bystander in the destruction that Dan has left in his wake and will continue to leave after he steals money out of Deanie's belongings. Behold, being an adult with superpowers holds responsibility. I'm sure there's some quote about that somewhere. And the reveal of Deanie's toddler really shows that she is more financially destitute than Dan is, but Dan in his greed and desperation fails to recognize how destructive he is. And so the cycle continues. He jumps ship from that city in North Carolina and runs aground in a quaint little town in New Hampshire called Fraser. But this time it's different. As when he hops off the bus, who does he see in the window of a turret room but his old shadowy friend, Tony? With images of Deanie and her child haunting his mind, and with Tony beckoning for him to stay for the first time and who knows for how long, he ditches the bottle that he'd been nursing since North Carolina to truly start anew. And between this, we were also treated to some scenes involving a young family of Italian descent and their daughter, Abra. Abra also clearly possesses the Shining, and even exhibited signs of her power during her infancy, where she predicted 9/11. No, this is not a joke. People were talking in loud voices, some were crying. The nurse who admitted them walked by, her face red and blotchy, her cheeks wet. She didn't even glance at the screaming infant. "A passenger jet hit the World Trade Center," Dolphin said, "and no one thinks it was an accident." That was American Airlines Flight 11. United Airlines Flight 175 struck the Trade Center's South Tower 17 minutes later at 9:03 a.m. At 9:03, Abra Stone abruptly stopped crying. By 9:04, she was sound asleep. Interestingly enough, Abra's powers are alluded to at her birth, with her grandmother making some comment about some sort of unknown psychic power. This power manifests itself in an even greater capacity at Abra's 6th birthday party, where she makes all the spoons in the kitchen magically adhere to the ceiling. We can now add telekinesis to the list of powers that the Shining seems to give people. So now we have our foundation for our story. Dan Torrance is on a path of redemption that starts his crash landing in New Hampshire. There's a group of magic vampires called the True Knot that stands as a threat to anyone who uses the Shining, and there's this mystery girl named Abra Stone who basically equates to the Chosen One. It's a lot, but this tangled web of information has a single highlighted thread that ties it all together: the redemption and sobriety of Dan Torrance. After hopping off the bus in Frasier, Dan Torrance has a chance encounter with an older gentleman named Billy Freeman, who offers to help Dan, for lack of a more apt term, get his shit together. He starts working at a hospice again, a job that he lands after talking with the straight-edge Casey Kingsley. And the scene where we're introduced to Casey is pretty interesting to me, because the way that the room is described makes me view him as a character that is making do with what little he's been given and taking pride in it. Judging by his vain, congested nose, Casey Kingsley had not always been death on drinkin'. He was a big man who didn't so much inhabit his small, cluttered office as wear it. Right now, he was rocked back in the chair behind his desk, going through Dan's references, which were kept neatly in a blue folder. The back of Kingsley's head almost touched the downstroke of a plain wooden cross hanging on the wall beside a framed photo of his family. In the picture, a younger, slimmer Kingsley posed with his wife and 3 bathing-suited kiddos on a beach somewhere. Through the ceiling, only slightly muted, came the sound of the village people singing YMCA, accompanied by the enthusiastic stomp of many feet. Dan imagined a gigantic centipede, one that had recently been to the local hairdresser and was wearing a bright red leotard about 9 yards long. Through Casey, Dan lands a job with the very strict guideline of attending AA meetings while keeping a journal of what Dan did while he was there. And so the protective nature of Casey makes him seem like the guiding father that Dan needed to properly develop into adulthood. And the dingy state of Casey's office states that Dan didn't need much, he just needed someone who was willing to work with what little they had. And while working at the hospice, Dan also has a chance run-in with another orderly named Fred Carling, and the perception that everyone has of Fred is best expressed in these entries. Carling was an unfeeling dolt, and how he'd gotten a job here even on the night shift when most of the guests were either asleep or trying to be quiet so they wouldn't disturb anyone else was beyond Dan. He suspected somebody might have pulled a wire or two. It was how the world worked. Claudette glanced down the hall to make sure Fred Carling wasn't in view, then lowered her voice anyway. That man's as useless as boobs on a bull. I keep hoping he'll get fired. You see what this is, though, right? Fred Carling is a manifestation of what Dan used to be. In place of his alcoholism, Fred is often seen nursing a bag of chips or other unhealthy snacks. His disorderly and uncaring conduct very much reflects the disruption that Dan had no doubt caused at his previous places of employment. Therefore, Fred Carling is what Dan could have been if Dan hadn't chosen to turn his life around in Frasier. And at the very, very end of the book, after the great evil has been defeated and Dan's story arc completes, who else is on his deathbed as a result of his poor health choices than Fred Carling himself? While they were relatively minor portions in volume in the grand scheme of the story, I found both Casey and Fred to be extremely important components of Dan's character. One offered a positive alternative to what Dan had grown up with, or without, for that matter, while the other was a mirror of what Dan had left behind, or could have become. During his employment at the hospice, Dan Torrance befriends a cat named Azzy, who seems to have a supernatural sense for when the residents from the hospice are approaching their last few moments. By following the cat, Dan finds out that he can use the shining to ease the souls of the almost departed as they pass away, easing them into a comfortable sleep. And this act doesn't go entirely unnoticed by the hospice staff, earning Dan the nickname of Dr. Sleep. And thus, we have our title. And now, the main conflict, which is gathered through the True Knot and Abra Stone. The True Knot sniffs out anybody in the country using the Shining, which is tracked by one of the members that they've named Barry the... Yeah, it's 2013 and we're still using racial slurs, but at least Stephen King is including Asian people now for no reason? What the fuck, man? Side note, that will become important later. I think that Stephen King tends to naturally disregard people of color in his novels. In The Shining, Dick Halloran's presence was almost always accompanied by a slur, and here in Dr. Sleep, everyone's white, and Barry's title is just a slur. King could have called this character anything else, but nope, let's just go for the thing that is obviously hateful. Anyway, the True Knot operates around Barry tracking down sources of food, and then Andy luring them in with her powers of shining suggestion. Most of their targets end up being children, mostly because children are vulnerable targets that don't know how to restrain their powers, which of course broadcast their location to the True Knot, and thus playing into the horror stories surrounding missing minors. And so, Abra is an extremely powerful child at age 12, making her a prime source and target for the True Knot, and it's up to Dan to work with her to repel the forces of evil. Abra was tall for her age, most of that height in her legs. Masses of curly blonde hair were held back in a thick ponytail that looked ready to rebel and spray everywhere. She grabbed a couple of books that were bungee corded to the rear bumper of her bike that ran up to him, still with that open smile. Pretty, but not beautiful, except for her wide-set blue eyes. They were beautiful. Which is another thing that's important for later. Initially, Dan receives communication from Abra and her psychic ability to write messages on the blackboard in Dan's home. I like to think of this as Abra gaining access to Dan's mind, as the room where the blackboard had been found was an allegory for Dan's cluttered mind, and now Abra has wandered her way in there but by what appears to be supernatural coincidence. Sure, stranger things have happened. Dementors roaming the United States in RV campers, locking demons away in mind lock boxes. Why not add this coincidence? Because who really knows how many people actually hold the Shining in the United States now? Abra eventually convinces Dan to meet her outside of a public library, positing that Dan could appear as her uncle, mostly to stave off appearing as a pedophile. And throughout the majority of this story, we are met with this dichotomy of Dan struggling to find his footing and the insurmountable task of protecting Abra against quasi-supernatural forces and eventually defeating those forces. I like to think of the plot as a whole as an antagonistic allegory to what Jack Torrance had faced in The Shining, where Jack had chosen to withdraw and face things internally. Dan is forced to reach out for help in unlikely places and take down external threats. Jack had a family and he threw it all away, while Dan eventually finds family, quite literally, in fact. Polar opposites, and yet because of where Dan had ended up following the trauma in his youth, Dr. Sleep ends up reading like Dan's redemption story. He finds purpose and clarity in his gifts, where he had tried to suppress them as much as possible before. Even if I am critical of the True Knot as a general concept, I still think they are a reasonable physical manifestation of what Dan needed to overcome in order to complete his character arc, and therefore the final showdown between Abra, Billy, Dan, and the remaining few members of the True Knot at the decrepit site of what used to be the Overlook Hotel is a perfect storybook ending to tie up the story. Towards the end of the book, it's also revealed that Abra's grandmother had an affair with Jack Torrance, meaning that Dan is Abra's actual uncle by coincidence, and that their psychic bond had been so close because they were family the whole time. It's a bit cheesy, I'll admit that, but it solidifies the themes of found family. And plus, it doesn't really matter because the whole time I'm out here like pumping my fists cheering for Dan Torrance and his gradual recovery and redemption. I mean, you mean to tell me that Abra and Dan are related? Well, heck yeah. Dan found his family again after they'd been taken away from him. Closing out the story with the passing of Fred Carling is such a great note to end on, because to me, it quite literally means that the pre-recovery path version of Dan is being put to rest. Dan's old self is dead, and he can continue to live his life as the best version of himself, wherever the character may go after the conclusion of this book. It's poetic, as I've said many times, and heartwarming, and we wouldn't have got here if it weren't for the griminess and destitution that we had seen Dan wallowing in at the start. And the AA meetings eventually come to a close, with this entry marking Dan's emancipation from the traumas that he had held all of these years. The women in the doorway had gone back to the kitchen. Some people were looking at their watches. A stomach grumbled. Looking at the assembled 9 dozen alkies, Dan realized an astonishing thing. What he'd done didn't revolt them. It didn't even surprise them. They had heard worse. Some had done worse. Before the applause, one of the old-timers in the back row shouted out the traditional question, "How'd you do it, Doc?" Dan smiled and gave the traditional answer, "One day at a time." So, now that we've reached the end of the narrative, how does the movie adaptation handle this harrowing, but ultimately uplifting story of one Dan Torrance? Dr. Sleep's movie adaptation was released in 2019 and was directed by Mike Flanagan. Flanagan is probably best known for his tendency to direct horror films with a greater focus on the emotional exasperations of its characters, given a quick look at his filmography, which dates back to his first short film in 2001. Interestingly enough, Flanagan's film career exploded during the mid to late 2010s, with Hush, Before I Wake, and Ouija Origin of Evil all releasing in 2016, all with mixed to positive reviews from critics. Flanagan's next film, a movie adaptation of Stephen King's Gerald's Game, came out 11 months after Ouija, followed by a 10-episode miniseries called The Haunting of Hill House, which started streaming on Netflix in October of 2018. All of this work, done in the space of 3 years, culminating in the release of Dr. Sleep again in October of 2019. The reason why I bring all this up is because from the loose information I can gather, and based on my viewings of Dr. Sleep, Flanagan is a decent filmmaker, but I wonder if having so much work done in a short time frame exasperated his creativity. From what I can tell after reading the books of both Dr. Sleep and The Shining, then comparing them to both of the specific adaptations in this video, I prefer The Shining for Kubrick's creativity and cinematography. Coming back around to this though, I actually feel like Mike Flanagan and James Mangold occupy a similar directorial niche in A-list movie making. I mean, Mangold's had some great films, but they have both made a decently well-regarded film that contributed to their rise in popularity and have since become inoffensive film industry shills. Mangold is by no means a poor director. I simply find more of his later works to be a bit more Hollywood polished and generally disinteresting, and Flanagan is in the same boat for me. Now, the best way to explain my simmering ire with the Dr. Sleep movie is that it is primarily in service of reminding the audience of The Shining. Flanagan's adaptation hardly pauses for breath before forcefully reminding the viewer of its legendary predecessor, and this happens so often that the movie is stripped down to a bare skeleton form with no credence given to the heart that drives the original narrative. It is simultaneously a movie that is more accurate to its source material while also being incapable of standing on its own due to the overbearing reference to a movie that was fairly well removed from its source material to begin with. I understand that it's a sequel, but sequels should not be so reliant on forcibly reminding you of the movie that came before it. Sure, being referential to the universe is key, but you don't want to be like Rise of Skywalker. What I find most insulting about this movie is that it thinks that the audience is kind of dumb, as if you can't reach to the natural conclusion yourself that this is a sequel to The Shining. The scene with Miss Massey at the start isn't enough to remind you. The scene with Dick Halloran's apparition isn't enough to remind you. No, we have to pile on the exact same orchestral strings when they don't make sense and use the same title card transitions as The Shining. Look guys, it's a sequel to The Shining. Do you remember one of horror's greatest flicks of all time, The Shining? This is a sequel to that. The other example that I can think of in regards to a movie that is well regarded and had its sequel released several decades later is Blade Runner 2049. And while both films take place in the same universe, the production itself is made to continue the world through the experiences of Officer K instead of trying to cheaply replicate the original. That's what gets me the most about Flanagan's movie, is that it so badly wants to attach itself to a masterpiece that preceded it almost 40 years prior, while consistently making creative decisions that undercut what made Kubrick's film iconic and what made King's writing hauntingly endearing. Towards the start of the movie, we see Dan waking up next to Deanie as he did in the book, but unlike the book, they're sleeping in a well-kept mattress with full covers, and the bathroom is clean and manicured. The setting itself is more of a regular townhouse, implying that young Deanie in 2013 was a single mom that could afford to maintain such a location, even with her habit of narcotics. I'm not trying to see a naked Ewan McGregor, but rather pointing out how from the very beginning there was a complete disrespect for the setting that was meant to physically represent Dan's turmoil. The whole opening segment with Deanie in the book is clearly written to show how somebody was at their lowest, and in movie Dan Torrance's case, his lowest is sleeping in a furnished home on a queen-size mattress with a working bathroom. Oh, but guys, he stole money and felt bad because he encountered Deanie's toddler. Guys, he's doing bad things out of desperation. At least he kind of looks like shit when he wakes up from being punched in the face the night before, but that's the bare minimum requirement. When Dan gets off the bus in Frasier, there's a weirdly ominous thrum that plays in the soundtrack that doesn't fit the setting at all. In The Shining, we had Jack Nicholson's face accompanying the iconic motif that communicated danger without any clear foundation being laid for the characters that were in the following shots. In this segment, we already know where Dan came from, and so the foreboding tone has no uncertainty to place itself on. The exposure for this shot is also turned way too high. It feels like a lot of the background is washed out and Dan's face is extremely dark in the foreground, and a lot of film feels like it was overexposed and then desaturated, possibly to hide imperfections in rush CG work or something along those lines. And true to the book, Dan meets Billy Freeman at the model train, and from here, Dan kicks off his life in Frasier. A few segments later, we show Dan being introduced to the AA meeting and he meets Dr. Dalton, but just like May from Night in the Woods, I want to know where Casey is. You know, the strict father figure that's meant to be the external motivation for Dan to attend these meetings to begin with, that keeps him in check throughout the book while providing him a job at the local hospice. I wonder when he'll show up. Alright, you caught me, I'm being facetious. Casey doesn't exist in this adaptation. Instead, Dr. Dalton is the person who offers Dan a position in the hospice after encountering him at the AA meeting. Now, Dalton does hold some significance in the book, and he was a character that I looked over because his relation to the story was more of a spectator role. He was someone that Dan could trust implicitly as time went on, but his direct involvement in Dan's life was way less than Casey's, for instance. Either way, when it comes to the idea of combining two characters for the sake of saving time, combining Dalton with Casey isn't the worst idea because Dalton's position as a medical professional gives him some authority over the life advice that he can offer to Dan. But simultaneously, if Dan had been working at hospices before, he would have been under the supervision of another lead doctor, meaning that Dalton's authority changes nothing between the phases of Dan's life. It's nothing new nor challenging to him. Dan needed the external authority figure in Casey, and the movie removes that, taking away another element from his character development. I'm also not a fan of the setting of Dalton's office, which is a far cry from the claustrophobic setting of Casey's in the book. Casey was written to represent the best that Dan could do in the moment, and Dalton's polished office that makes him look like a political candidate is a distinct separation from that reality.
And I'm gonna interrupt myself right here for just a moment because I realized while I was watching this scene back for a third time that this is actually meant to directly replicate the scene of Jack Nicholson or Jack Torrance getting interviewed at the Overlook Hotel. Dalton's desk is set up almost identically to Stuart Ullman's in the Overlook Hotel. Even the color of the walls is the same kind of peachy orange color that it was in the Overlook when Jack was getting interviewed. So I think instead of trying to make this Dan's story, they were trying very hard to sell the visual parallel, and I think that's still a little bit more pandering because this could have easily been its own thing, but we have to try and be like, oh look, that's a visual reference to this thing that happened before. Anyway, back on to the rest of the video. Then there's the segment where Dan sees his new lodgings in the turret room, which in the book had been colorfully described as being cluttered with an ironmongery of wheelchairs with a discarded blackboard being in the corner. In fact, there's even an entry in the book that specifically says that Dan's mind is like a blackboard and that booze was the eraser. So that blackboard in and of itself does represent Dan's mind. And in my interpretation, the cluttering of the wheelchairs represented Dan's cluttered mental state, where he had the tools that were made to actually help people and had the capacity to do them, but he had been beating them into submission and discarding them into the corner to never be seen again. However, in the movie, this is a weirdly desaturated attic bedroom. It's already fully furnished and perfectly clean. Initially, I thought that maybe he'd already done up the room and Mrs. Clausen here was talking about the rental terms, but the dialogue reveals that this is most likely Dan's first time seeing the room.
Rent's $85 a week, payable up front.
Also, her name is Mrs. Robinson in this movie. I don't know why that change was made. Was there something wrong with the name Clausen? Oh, and not to mention that.
Last guy said the same. Math student. Even let him paint the wall all blackboard.
Somebody else lived inside Dan's head already. Let me say that again. Somebody else had already lived here. This wasn't cleaned up by Dan. The blackboard wasn't something that he found gathering dust in the corner. Somebody else had already done up the wall in blackboard paint because that's just how they were. So let me get this straight. The movie shows Dan Torrance at a low, but not the lowest possible point of his life, because that would be too difficult, removes Casey from the narrative and rewrites the physical parallel of him clearing out his head. They practically sanitize the character of what makes his motivation compelling to begin with, showing someone pulling themselves out of the worst hole of their lives. What's next? They remove Fred Carling from the story? Oh, come the yes, Fred Carling, who is a mirror opposite of Dan Torrance, who dies at the end of the novel to metaphorically represent Dan dying to his old self, doesn't exist. I believe the majority of these decisions are made in service of what Flanagan thinks the goal of the story is, which is defeating the True Knot. But without the external motivation, Dan isn't exactly compelled to stop them, and he effectively becomes John the Baptist, ushering in Shining Jesus. And the movie also takes itself way too seriously at times. Obviously, yes, there are some very graphic scenes, especially pertaining to dead children, but there's also a bit of humor and personality in the dialogue between the various characters in the book. And none of that snark is really all that apparent, and it all feels like the dialogue was hosed down for the sake of moving the plot along. Hello, I am character, and I will say line. Please respond with your immediate solution. Mrs. Clausen has a lot of sass for Dan Torrance when she's showing him the terror room in the book, but all she does in the movie is say the bare minimum to introduce Dan to his new lodgings, with a little twinge at the end maybe. The result of these changes is that when the story begins to take an absurd supernatural twist, there's no goofiness from the less serious moments to help suspend disbelief. Everyone talks like they're reading from a news reporter's transcript, and then we're supposed to take things seriously when vampires show up? It just doesn't fit, but because the movie technically aligns itself with scenes that look similar enough to how they're paced in the book, we're all supposed to believe that this is how King wanted it. So if I were to make an encapsulating statement about the Dr. Sleep movie, it's that Mike Flanagan's misinterpretation of the events, where you can name things and display things in a similar way to how they're written, needlessly misses the crucial details as to why that decision was made. Comparatively, when Kubrick made changes to the narrative, he was still able to accurately capture the somber tone of King's isolated setting. The Shining stands on its own as an incredible film because of Kubrick's attention to detail, and even though the story is changed from what was written in the book, the difference is that I'm being presented with the shared details as they were written. The first time that I saw Dr. Sleep was immediately after watching The Shining, but before I read the book, my immediate thoughts were, wow, that was nothing like the movie before it. And knowing that Stephen King himself disliked The Shining for how it wasn't accurate to the book he wrote, I thought that reading both The Shining and Dr. Sleep would help contextualize the latter's film adaptation. Heck, I wrote this review on Letterboxd before I even read the book, which you can read through if you're interested. After reading the book, I can definitely assert what I've already touched on, how there is imagery that is evocative of the book itself, but it completely misses the important details in its settings and character development. In doing so, Flanagan communicates that the goal of King's book was defeating the True Knot, which I've already made explicitly clear isn't the case at all. Yet I feel like I'm taking crazy pills because the general consensus is that this movie is good, or at least not terrible. It has a 3.4 out of 5 on Letterboxd and a 7.3 out of 10 on IMDb, with reviews like the ones that I shared at the very start of this video. And while writing this, I found a review from Adam of YMS, whose perspective was a lot more on how dumb the characters were and how much the movie dangled member berries in front of its audience. The comments on that video criticized Adam's perspective, and it's genuinely one of the most negative comment sections that I've read through. I also made the mistake of engaging with one of those engagement farming posts on the Letterboxd subreddit, which basically said,
"What movie did you dislike that you were surprised people loved?"
To which I replied, Dr. Sleep. One reply said that the movie wasn't loved. Oh, look out guys, we have a Reddit contrarian here. While another said that it was more true to the book and that they outright disagreed with me. So, to refute that, Dr. Sleep as a movie has some story beats that are similar to the book, but without the importance of the setting or the importance of its central character. I've been over this countless times, but when I see comments like this, I begin to wonder if anyone actually read the book, or if they're parroting opinions that they happen to come across. Look, it's the scene where Abra makes some spoons magically adhere to the ceiling. Oh, that was in the book. Look, it's the scene where Dan meets Billy at the model train. That was in the book. Look, it's a cat. That's the cat from the book. And yet these comments mysteriously disappear when they're asked about Casey and Fred.
and when they're asked about the death of Billy Freeman, which doesn't happen in the book, or when they're asked about the final showdown between the True Knot and Dan and Billy and Abra in the mountains of Colorado. There's a level of cunning that's written into the book here, and an astonishing amount of detail that is extremely key to the story, and these people are all missing it for the sake of pointing at their TV screens and being like, oh, hey, that's just like the book. I'm starting to doubt that many of you parading this statement around even read it to begin with, and are often repeating sentiments that you hope are true because you like Stephen King more than you like Stanley Kubrick. The other argument that I see arises from this is that I don't like this movie because it's not like The Shining, so how can I say that if Dr. Sleep is closer to the book? I can say that because this movie also sucks for all the reasons that I've gone over that are independent of the novel. And it still does an awful job at paying homage to its source material in the movie before it, and I will die on this weirdly misshapen hill to prove my point. The first thing that really stuck out to me about Dr. Sleep was the editing. It is shot and edited significantly faster than The Shining, distractingly so. Where Kubrick was deliberate in his long sweeping takes that made the setting as much of a character as the people within them, Flanagan's film fails to do much of anything that was separated from a Jason Statham action flick. That's how a lot of this movie feels, like a pointless action film that wants to so desperately be perceived as good because of its connections to another property. I often felt far too close to the characters, or too bored by the lifeless cinematography. If two characters are talking in this film, they're almost always standing at the same distance from the center of the shot. If there's action going on, there's a shaky cam with a billion cuts to hide the imperfections in the effects work. Even if it is argued that the movie is more of a supernatural horror thriller, most of the horror elements are shot in such uncreative manners, leaning more into the filmmaking techniques that we see in Marvel movies. If you compare the likes of Dr. Sleep to other contemporary horror films in a similar genre like Hereditary or Talk to Me, Dr. Sleep sticks out as a relatively uninspired and cynical by not using the camera or clever lighting effects to unsettle the senses. There are some jump scares and visually grotesque scenes within the movie, but they're all without the carefully drawn out camera shots that are usually designed to make you want to look away. If anything, the choice of editing and camera work further degrades the horrifying content that could be found within this movie, and I'd almost say that it looks downright goofy at times, the relative flatness in the filmmaking versus the exuberant and ultimately underwhelming acting performances. And by exuberant but underwhelming, I mean in the sense of overacting, or the actor not playing the character and just coming off as if they're just saying lines. Not all the acting in the movie was bad, but aside from Ewan McGregor, none of the performances felt grounded to the characters. To McGregor's credit, he was doing his best with a shaved down version of his character in the book, but his ability to carry a scene felt like it far outshone everyone else that was involved. Rebecca Ferguson's accent felt like it changed in every other scene, and her serious tone was far outweighed by how goofy she looked. I don't think she played the role poorly per se, but I do think she was miscast. My cynicism leads me to believe that she was picked as a popular name to put into the trailer rather than someone who fit her role the best. This movie did come out in 2019, sandwiched in between her roles as Isla Faust in the Mission Impossible movies, so it was safe to say that she was a fairly topical actress at the time. Kylie Curran, on the other hand,
you're magic, like me.
I really do feel bad for children in Hollywood because of the weight of expectations placed on them at such young ages. Curran in this film has a couple of good lines, and she fulfills her role as a whimsical 14-year-old pretty well because, well, she was 14 when this movie came out. I'm sure that finding another child actor that could have played this role would have proven difficult, but she carries that whimsy into the scenes that are meant to be serious. She often doesn't match the tone, and in that sense her performance isn't sinister or grand, it's just kind of boring. And a slightly controversial take that I have here is that she isn't Caucasian. Now, King isn't great when it comes to his portrayals of people of color, but the only two characters whose complexions actually matter are Dan and Abra. Dan because he has to look like the boy from The Shining, and Abra because she is directly related to Dan, and both have to pass as related in their first meeting outside the library so that Dan looks like less of a pedophile. It's not too big of a deal, and I'm willing to bet that the casting choice was made because there weren't many actors that could fulfill Abra's role like Kylie Curran did, but it more so comes off as another change that further alienates Dan from the story itself by removing what would be a clear familial connection otherwise. A lot of this could have been avoided if Flanagan's film had redoubled its focus on Dan Torrance to make him the main character, but it doesn't.
After Dan is introduced and he moves into his position at the hospice, he gradually becomes a vessel and side character to Abra, who is unfortunately not compelling enough of a character to carry the movie on her own shoulders. Most of Abra's character in the book is designed to be a side character because she is an active component in the choice that Dan has to make. That choice being to better himself and find his family. When Abra becomes the focus, she is actively I'm Sean Connery. When Abra becomes the focus, she is actively taking away time that could be spent on Dan's redemption, since she was merely a component of that story. Yet, the movie's attempted adherence to its source material doesn't change enough in its screenplay to make Abra a compelling character. She lives in a beautiful home with 2 loving parents, has full awareness of her superpowers, though she can't control them all the time, oh no, and seems to be doing pretty fine in most other aspects. I guess that the other kids at her school call her a freak and her dad dies off screen, but this happens in the latter third of the film. When the showdown between Rose the Hat and Abra happens towards the end of the movie, a lot of these problems are just glossed over. There's literally one shot where Mrs. Stone is seen on the steps of her home crying in front of police tape because her husband was murdered, but when the movie wraps up, Abra and her mom are still in the same home? Nothing has changed. There's no consequences. Nothing matters. Flanagan had to slightly rewrite the ending of this movie to account for the fact that the Overlook Hotel didn't blow up in Kubrick's adaptation, and therefore Dan hatches a plan to lure Rose to the Overlook. There, he will overload the Overlook's boiler and set the decrepit hotel ablaze to burn everything within, setting the story to rest for once and for all. The scenes in the hotel are pretty neat, and it feels like it's where most of the movie's budget went. And according to some trivia that I read on this movie, Flanagan recreated the hotel according to some blueprints that were artifacts from Kubrick's estate. It does feel like pointless nostalgia bait at times though, but I can at least partially appreciate the attention to detail to recreate the iconic set pieces. I also really like this actor that they got to replicate old Jack Torrance. That was neat. Anyway, the hotel goes up in flames with an injured Dan still standing within. Police sirens sound off in the background as Abra stands alone watching the blaze. Crossfade transition happens and we see Abra back in her bedroom talking to Dan Torrance, but he is an apparition. He isn't really there. There's a line where Abra says, "Well, at least you're okay."
I knew you were okay.
But we're led to believe that this is a shining apparition and that Dan is actually dead. So Dan dies, and despite defeating the physical monsters from his past, he never gets to confront the actual monsters in his own life, never gets to find his family again, and never gets to prove his improvement and acceptance of himself. In his place, we have Abra, who already has everything she needs, and wasn't written to have a hero's journey as much as she was an incidental component of it. And yet, the movie tries to make the side character the main character without understanding what they're replacing as a whole. That's what my problem is with Dr. Sleep. King's books are gross in writing at times, yes, but I've found through my ratings of The Shining, Dr. Sleep, and even Fairy Tale that he often chooses to offset the unsettling nature of his material by giving his characters a redemptive side to them. Abra, unfortunately, does not have a whole lot to redeem her in the book, and by centering the movie around her, the actual narrative becomes stale. Even immediately after watching this movie again, the only thing I remembered was my boyfriend busting up laughing at this line delivery.
You're gonna die here.
Oh, wow! That is relatable!
And so, Dr. Sleep's movie ends on an ultimately boring note for what could have been a far more compelling narrative if it had actually taken stock of its source material. What I will say is that when a book is written to have intentionally written in specific characters, Casey and Fred, with a specific focus, with visual details being vital as important representations of the main character's psyche, you can't deny that it's ultimately disappointing to see something with such great potential become ultimately relegated to what feels like a superhero thriller or like a middling action film, as if we don't have enough of those already. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go back to purchasing various indie games and letting them rot on my Steam shelf. Bye-bye.